Subcommittee will come to order, and thank you to our very highly distinguished witnesses for being here and for taking the time to provide your insights and counsel to the subcommittee. Ladies and gentlemen, to say the Great Lakes region of Africa is troubled would be an understatement. Burundi is experiencing continued turmoil due to a recent contentious election. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, has had some level of conflict since the late 1990s. The Lord's Resistance Army, also known as the LRA, has plagued several of these countries. Alleged plundering of the DRC resources by Rwanda and Uganda has never been fully resolved. Nations in the region have been preoccupied in the last 2 years with resolving the South Sudan civil war. Definitions vary, but the Great Lakes region as defined by the U.S. Department of State comprises Burundi, DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda. The region is among the most densely populated in Africa, especially around Lake Victoria, and enjoys rich agricultural potential, water resources, minerals, and wildlife. However, political instability, conflict, humanitarian crises, and lack of development remain key challenges. These 4 countries are the purview of the U.S. Special Envoy to the Great Lakes, Tom Perriello, we are delighted to have here today, a former member of the House and a former member of a committee that I served on for years, and that's the Veterans Affairs Committee. So, Tom, thank you for being here. We also have Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, an expert in the field, Linda Thomas Greenfield, who has spent a great deal of her time in office dealing with the Great Lakes and a great deal of time on the road. It's been hard to get you up here, but I know, as you said just a moment ago, you've been spending 3 weeks out of 4 on the road, and that is very commendable on your part to spend so much time working on these issues. Today's hearing offers an opportunity to hear from these top administration officials, not only about continuing U.S. efforts to extinguish the LRA threat, but also the administration's work with governments in the region on issues such as peace building, governance, and adherence to internationally recognized human rights and democracy. In our subcommittee hearings over the last 3 years, we have uncovered numerous troubling situations. Even with the supposed end of the operations by M23 militia in eastern DRC in late 2013, there are several other militias still causing instability in the region. The Kabila government in the DRC reportedly is using a ban on completing foreign adoptions as leverage to ward off actions to prevent him from prolonging his role despite a constitutional bar to any re-election bid. The Burundi president's decision to run for a 3rd term, with some Burundians and outside observers viewed as a violation of a landmark peace agreement and arguably the Constitution of Burundi, has led to a political crisis and heightened concerns about regional stability. Human rights abuses in Rwanda were found to be targeted towards real or perceived political opponents prior to 2012, but after 2012, such abuses were seen as more random, expanding the targets of the regime. Major Robert Higero, a retired Rwandan military officer, told our subcommittee on May 20th about his solicitation by the Rwandan intelligence chief to kill high-level defectors. He turned against the government and informed the targets who asked him to record the offer. He did, and the recording was validated by the Globe and Mail in Canada and the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC. The State Department has not only found the allegation to be credible, but warned Major Higero to leave Belgium, where his life was in danger. Although LRA killings have diminished in the past few years, kidnappings by the group have risen as it operates in smaller, scattered cells, using more adults as contemporary labor. One witness at our hearing last month said an end to the U.S. support for counter-LRA effort would be devastating, and I'm very I believe that the administration will continue that counter-LRA effort, and that's encouraging. We have heard of the difficulties of addressing issues in this troubled region of Africa by both governments and private witnesses over the last few years. However, the fates of these countries are interconnected, and our policies need to take that into account. I'd like to yield to Mr. Cicilline for any opening comments you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this hearing today, and to our distinguished witnesses for being here to share your experiences and recommendations for U.S. policy toward this region. When we think of the Great Lakes region in Africa, what so often comes to mind is the incredible conflict and suffering that the region has experienced in recent decades. The wars in Burundi and DRC and genocide in Rwanda unleashed true horrors upon the population. But despite their troubled past, the countries of the Great Lake region, including Burundi, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, and Uganda, have made some progress. Peace accords restored a semblance of stability to Burundi and the DRC. Rwanda has become an example in terms of economic development in the region, and Uganda has experienced relative peace and stability. I recently visited Rwanda, and they had the opportunity to see some of this progress firsthand. However, there remain great challenges to regional stability and for the forward progress of these countries. Public health issues, violence against women, HIV and AIDS, and food security remain challenges throughout the region. Moreover, leaders in Burundi, DRC, and Rwanda have indicated reluctance to allow for peaceful transitions of power. Burundian President Pierre Nkurunziza's decision to run for a third term in contravention of the Arusha Accords is very troubling, as are indications that the presidents of the DRC and Rwanda may attempt to circumvent term limits in their own countries. President Museveni has ruled Uganda since 1986. I firmly believe that the further economic development of these countries and improvements in their health, safety, and food security will be directly tied to their acceptance of free and fair democratic process. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today as to how Congress can encourage these countries to maintain a democratic trajectory. And with that, I yield back and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to yield to Vice Chairman of the committee, Mark Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for continuing to make humanitarian relief a focus of this committee on a regular basis. And for me, it is very gratifying to have both of you here to testify today. We look forward to hearing not only your expert testimony, but how we can go beyond a hearing and make an impact in countries that most Americans would have a hard time finding on a map. We see the devastation, we hear the stories, but they're headlines and they're far away. And we need to do a better job as members of Congress, but we also need to do a better job of highlighting those areas where we can make a difference. And so I look forward to hearing from both of you on perhaps two things that we're doing well, but two things that we need drastic improvement on, and that way we can have actionable items. So with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. I'd like to introduce our two distinguished witnesses, beginning first with Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, a member of the Career Foreign Service who was sworn in on August 6th, 2013 as the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. Prior to assuming her current position, she led a team of about 400 employees who carried out personnel functions for the State Department's 70,000-strong workforce. Since beginning her Foreign Service career in 1982, note parenthetically, a year after I got elected to Congress, she has risen through the ranks to the minister consular level, serving in Jamaica, Nigeria, the Gambia, Kenya, Pakistan, and at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, and most recently as ambassador to Liberia, where she served from 2008 to 2012. Without objection, your full resume and both of yours will be made a part of the record. And then we'll hear from the Honorable Thomas Perriello, Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region of Africa. Previously served as Special Representative for the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, and also served as a congressman from Virginia. And I would note, I also served on the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, and I thank him for that service. I served on that committee as well. And as Special Advisor to the Prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, an extremely effective court that was led by David Crane, as we all know, and ultimately secured a major conviction, and that was of Charles Taylor, who got 50 years for the atrocities that he unleashed upon the people in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And he's also served as CEO of the Center for American Progress Action. He has worked and conducted research in a dozen countries and taught courses on transitional justice at the University of Virginia School of Law and the University of Sierra Leone. Outside of government, Mr. Perriello has co-founded and managed justice entrepreneurship platforms and faith-based organizations advancing human rights, poverty reduction, and sustainability. Madam Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith, and thanks to the other members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today on the many challenges facing the Central African region. I'm honored to testify here today with Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region of Africa, Tom Perriello, and one of your old colleagues. The Department and the Bureau of African Affairs in particular greatly appreciates the bipartisan support we continue to receive for our work, for our embassies, and for our people who spend every single day striving to promote our national security, foreign policy, and economic interests on the continent of Africa. In the Central African region, particularly in the countries of Rwanda, Burundi, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Republic of Congo, our efforts to strengthen democratic institutions, spur economic growth, and advance peace and security, and promote opportunity and development have borne fruit. However, the progress made in this region is fragile, and it is at great risk, as you both all described in your remarks. In fact, this is the region that I am most concerned about, as it is way out of step of the progressions that the rest of the continent is making. I know that you're interested in our continuing efforts to combat the Lord's Resistance Army, also known as the LRA, and I'm pleased to report that we actually have had some good success there, in fact, great success, working through our regional partners, notably Uganda and the African Union. The Central African Republic, despite intense conflicts in that country, Democratic Republic of Congo with its political issues, South Sudan at war with itself, all have actively provided assistance to us in countering the LRA. Over 270 people have either defected, escaped, or been released since 2012. 4 of the 5 top commanders are in The Hague. The number of people killed by the LRA has dropped by 90% since 2010, when 365 were killed, and we've had 19 kills since June 30 of 2015. Even that is too many, but it is a significant decrease. These numbers make it clear that our strategy is working, but Joseph Kony is still commanding the remnants of the LRA, and until he is brought to justice, we remain committed to finishing the work that we have started. President Obama's July speech to the African Union in Addis Ababa, where he addressed the critical issue of democratic transition, including term limits, respect for constitutions, and the peaceful transfer of leadership, has resonated resoundingly on the continent. The core principles the President elaborated are the cornerstone of our engagement with leaders whose time in office should be coming to an end, and note that I said should. Over the next 2 years, each of the countries in this region has faced or will face the opportunity to realize a true democratic transfer of power. Yet, in each of these countries, that agreed-upon process is in doubt. The leaders of these nations have been making fateful decisions whether or not to abide by their previous commitments, respect the rule of law in their constitutions, and responsibly build the foundation of peaceful, elected, democratic leadership and transition. In Burundi, President Nkurunziza's pursuit of a 3rd term caused the current volatile political crisis. Prevailing circumstances have forced over 200,000 Burundians to flee into neighboring countries since April, and many of those attempting to flee have reported violent confrontations by party militias and police. Special Envoy Perriello just returned from the region and will provide more context on our current efforts there. While the Republic of Congo is outside our definition of the Great Lakes region, its impact upon it impacts it and is affected by similar situations as elsewhere in the region. President Sassou Nguesso's decision to call for a popular referendum on a proposed new constitution is deeply troubling and has created a volatile situation that could spiral beyond the government's control with tragic results. And as I speak today, the current situation in the country is very, very tense. I now turn to circumstances across the Congo River in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Before I get into the electoral and security situations, I would like to assure you, the members of Congress, and any of your constituents who are anxiously waiting to bring their adopted children home, that we remain closely engaged with DRC officials at the highest levels to lift the ban on exit permits for the hundreds of legally adopted children who are unable to join their new families. And we will not cease in our efforts until all of these cases are resolved. On the political front, we remain deeply concerned by the situation in DRC. President Kabila's final term is due to end in December of 2016. Efforts by the president to amend the Constitution or guarantee electoral delays have been vigorously resisted, even by some of his own majority in the DRC parliament, and certainly by his citizens. Tom has also just concluded a visit from that country, and he will go into more details on our analysis and our approach to the situation. But I must note that At this time, I don't see that DRC is yet at a precipice. President Kabila faces a choice. He can establish a tradition of peaceful transition of power for his country, or he can set back the significant progress that he himself has made during his tenure by trying to stay in office beyond his term. Finally, on Rwanda, the United States has been a strong partner with Rwanda while it has made significant and commendable strides in spurring economic growth and promoting development following the devastating 1994 genocide. We continue to encourage Rwanda, however, to demonstrate significantly greater respect for human rights and democratic principles. Thus, I have to admit we were very disappointed when the Rwandan government established a constitutional reform commission that has recommended removing executive term limits that would permit President Kagame to seek a third term in 2017, and we have urged him against this. Representative Smith, Ranking Member Bass, who is not yet in the room, and members of the subcommittee, I want to thank you again for holding this hearing, giving us the opportunity to discuss our extensive engagement in the region, and I hope that the information that we share with you today, as well as with the audience here, is helpful. I look forward to answering all of your questions, as I know Tom will.
Madam Ambassador, thank you very, very much. I'd like to now yield the floor to Special Envoy Perriello.
Chairman Smith, members of the committee, thank you so much for the invitation to testify today and for your unwavering interest in the comprehensive efforts to support peace, democracy, and development in the Great Lakes region. I'm honored to be back on Capitol Hill, to have this opportunity to serve, and to get to testify here today with one of the true all-stars of the Foreign Service, Assistant Secretary Linda Thomas-Greenfield. As she outlined, we greatly appreciate the broad support from Capitol Hill for our engagement, our values, our programs, and our embassies in the region. After decades of instability and of international investment in peace, the next 2 years will determine much about the future of the Great Lakes region. The run-up to elections in the Republic of Congo, the DRC, Rwanda, and Uganda, and the ensuing crisis from Burundi's discredited elections will determine much about whether the region will reap the benefits of decades of investments in security and democracy, or rather trade in that hard-fought progress for the entrenchment of individual leaders. It is for this reason that I am focusing my testimony today on these upcoming elections and our efforts to support them, although I'll be more than happy to answer questions on other issues afterwards. The crisis in Burundi is a prime example of what happens when an individual clings to power at the expense of his country. President Nkurunziza's decision to stand for a third term and violate the Arusha Agreement has triggered a complex and dire crisis. Months of government repression, a failed coup attempt, discredited elections, tit-for-tat assassinations, and a mounting humanitarian crisis leave Burundi facing a shorter and shorter fuse. Open political space has been all but eliminated in Burundi, creating an environment of intimidation and fear where daily violence and assassinations have become the norm. Much of the violence is reportedly carried out at the hands of state security services and the Imbonerakure, the armed wing of the ruling party's youth militia, but also by groups aligned with different political parties acting in retaliation. Their actions risk an expanded civil war as well as state failure. While Burundi's past conflicts have been marked by horrific ethnic massacres, the current crisis has thus far avoided this element. However, we worry with continued instability, the risk for the conflict to take on an ethnic component grows. Perhaps most pressing, Burundi's economy is in freefall, which will continue to exacerbate the suffering of the Burundian people already among the world's poorest, and many of whom suffer from malnutrition even before the crisis. We generally support regional leadership in resolving conflicts. However, certain regional dynamics in this case are impeding progress. Those in the region interested in testing their own country's term limit provisions are watching Burundi out of their own self-interest. Those supporting Nkurunziza also argue that our focus on term limits comes at the expense of stability. But the facts prove quite the opposite. Regular democratic transitions of power are in the best interest of a country's stability. No credible observer thinks Burundi would not be better off if Nkurunziza had allowed constitutional elections to proceed. The international community would be talking about targeted investments, not targeted sanctions. We would be talking about Burundi as a model, not as a cautionary tale. There are also broader geopolitical dynamics to play here. Some countries side with Burundi's government because they believe the instability is being driven not by legitimate discontent by Burundians, but by Rwanda's support for the opposition. This is reviving historic geopolitical fault lines and risks holding back regional consensus on next steps to resolve the crisis. We encourage Rwanda, Tanzania, and all neighboring countries to be a force for peaceful resolution. We believe that an inclusive, immediate, and internationally mediated dialogue amongst Burundian stakeholders under EAC and AU leadership is the best route to resolve this crisis. We were heartened to see strong leadership and consensus at the African Union last weekend, when the Peace and Security Council called for the resumption of an inclusive dialogue to be held outside of the country under the facilitation of President Museveni. We support the AU's leadership in demanding more urgent progress towards dialogue and consequences for those who impede it. Regarding our next steps, we're pursuing all available diplomatic tools to convince Burundian stakeholders, the region, and the international community to support the immediate resumption of dialogue. We've already significantly curtailed our security assistance to the Burundian government, and all remaining non-life-saving U.S. assistance is being reviewed. While we strongly support the peacekeeping missions in Somalia and CAR, Central African Republic, our ongoing support for Burundi's participation could be suspended if the government continues on its current path. We are reviewing options for holding individuals accountable for acts of violence and human rights abuses. In this effort, we support the AU's call for sanctions and the EU's recent decision to impose targeted sanctions to hold accountable those whose actions they determined have led to acts of unlawful violence and serious human rights abuses. Lastly, the interagency is working with the White House on contingency planning for the possibility of more widespread violence in Burundi. We laud the AU for also pursuing such planning and will support efforts to prevent mass atrocities. Whereas Burundi has already made a costly decision to pursue a dangerous path, the leadership of the DRC still faces a choice, a crossroads, with its presidential elections currently scheduled for November 2016. Good elections would bolster the DRC's democratic development and be a critical step in addressing governance issues that have been a fundamental aspect of decades of instability. On the other hand, a delayed or illegitimate election could set off a far greater crisis than we have seen in Burundi. The DRC Constitution states unambiguously that a president may serve only 2 consecutive terms in office, and this provision cannot be amended. The government's attempts to change the electoral process in a way that could extend President Kabila's tenure have been staunchly rejected by the population, many of the president's own political supporters, their parliament, and civil society. There are technical challenges that must be addressed if national elections are to be held on time. The current bloated electoral calendar is already off track. The voting rolls have not been updated since the last elections, and the National Electoral Commission, or CENI, recently became leaderless with the resignation of its president, Abi Malu Malu. Beyond the timing and logistics of elections, the most concerning trend in the DRC is the alarming escalation of political repression and the closing of political space. Disturbing reports of extrajudicial killings, use of excessive force against demonstrators, and trumped-up convictions of civil society leaders are all of serious concern. Challenges outlined above are not insurmountable, but a 2016 election will require Congolese political leaders to quickly reach consensus on next steps. First, the DRC needs a revised and realistic electoral calendar, which prioritizes presidential and parliamentary elections next year and consolidates multiple rounds of voting. Second, the DRC government and the CENI should agree upon a budget, and the government should disperse the necessary funds. Third, the CENI should greenlight a process for updating existing voter rolls. Fourth, candidates, parties, and government officials should all make a pledge for nonviolence. And fifth, the DRC government should resume cooperation with MONUSCO to ensure proper security given the acute risk of instability and violence during the election period. We will continue to engage the DRC government, CENI, opposition parties, and civil society to support the upcoming elections and to maintain and reopen political space. We will also continue to work with our donor partners on public engagement and electoral support. Our goal is simple: let the voice of the Congolese people shape their country's bright future. Finally, Rwanda's elections are not until 2017, but the Rwandan government is already taking steps to enable President Kagame to remain in office beyond current constitutional term limits. While we respect the ability of any parliament to pass legislation that reflects the will of the people, we continue to firmly support the principle of democratic transition of power in all countries and respect for existing constitutional term limit provisions. We do not support incumbents amending constitutions to stay in power, as doing so undermines democratic institutions and is an ingredient for instability. The fate of democracy in Rwanda is about more than just the next election. Political freedoms continue to be limited, creating an environment where open debate and disagreements about security and political issues are rarely seen. Respect for human rights is a pillar of democracy and credible elections. Let me conclude these introductory remarks with a few general takeaways. First, countries in the region are watching closely what happens in Burundi and the Republic of Congo with their own elections in mind. Second, there must be consequences when leaders deliberately exchange their country's stability for their own hold on power. Sanctions and cuts to assistance, as targeted as possible, must be part of this equation. Third, courageous citizens across the region take great personal risk each day to defend fundamental freedoms and a future many of us take for granted. The Pierre Clavets, the Yves, the Freds. The future of the region will be forged by those who stand for a democratic future, but our policy can reinforce and protect their efforts. Fourth, high-level U.S. and international engagement will be pivotal between now and 2017 as the region is watching how donors respond to actions in the region. Despite the worrying signs across the region, I want to end on a positive note. There is still a window for all Burundian stakeholders to come together in a dialogue before this escalates to war. There is time for the DRC to organize credible and historic elections to see the first peaceful democratic transition, and for Rwanda's story to be one of great economic growth and democratization. But time is of the essence, as is strong bipartisan U.S. leadership. Thank you very much.
Without objection, Tom, your full statement will be made part of the record, as well as yours, Madam Ambassador. Let me just ask a few opening questions. First of all, we did have a hearing on the LRA on September 30th, and there was a consensus among our witnesses that not only elimination, but even a limitation on the current U.S. deployment could be catastrophic. And I just hope you can reassure us that that's not in the offing. And you point out, and the evidence is very clear, there's been a 90% decrease in killings, a 30% decrease in attacks by the LRA since the deployment in 2011. And yet there's been not an increase, but a troubling number of abductions, particularly of Congolese, that have occurred over the last 4 years. 417 was the number that was cited to us. And I'm just wondering, one of the things that came out of that hearing as well was the importance of U.S. leadership, the Ugandans and the others who have very capable troops deployed, as to how that could all fall apart too, without the U.S. command and control and some of the other counterinsurgency expertise that is brought to bear. So if you could just speak to that and how important that deployment has been, and hopefully will continue, how well the other nations have stood up troops, because again, we don't want those troops to go away. We want them to stay focused until Coney is brought to justice, as well as those who have committed atrocities.
Well, let me just say that we're very proud of what we have achieved so far. Again, we don't want to sit on our hands and pat ourselves on the back yet, because Coney is still out there. And as long as Coney is still out there, we remain committed to working with governments in the region to address this issue. We believe that the comprehensive strategy that we put forth, incorporating military and civilian efforts, is helping the regional governments to make significant progress to degrade LRA's capabilities and reduce the threat that they pose to the communities around them. And I want to note that we conduct regular interagency reviews to ensure that this effort is making sufficient progress. Our most recent review concluded that it continues to do so. So we will continue to remain committed to this effort. I have had several meetings with President Museveni over the past few months and raised this issue with him and got his commitment that he was willing to stay the course until Coney was captured. And so I think we're in a good place.
On the issue of adoption, we held a hearing on July 16th with a focus on African adoptions in general and DRC in particular. And the concerns expressed by parents and families who actually know their children but can't get that permit to allow them to leave the country. Peter Pan, I should say, of the Atlantic Council, who has appeared before our committee many times, recently wrote an op-ed accusing Kabila of blocking the departure to the United States of legally adopted children as a form of blackmail against pressure to follow the Constitution. If you could just provide further insights as to what is causing, the factors that are causing the ability of these children to find that loving home that just awaits them, and whether or not Dr. Pham, is raising a legitimate point with regards to the reason, or one of the reasons why Kabila is dragging his feet.
I don't know that I could speak for the motives of President Kabila and the government of DRC, but I do want to say that we have put undue pressure on the government to relinquish these children and to allow them to exit the country. President Obama called President Kabila to urge him to action. Secretary Kerry has pressed Kabila to resolve this matter. We've had the Assistant Secretary for Consular Affairs travel to the DRC in March and August. We had one of my deputies, Stu Symington, also engaged with the government when he was there in August. Dr. Jill Biden sent a letter to President Kabila and to his sister to encourage him. Special Envoy Perriello has visited, and he raised this issue. And during the UN General Assembly last month in New York, the two of us met with the government, with the foreign minister, and we put this first on our agenda, which surprised him, that this was at the top of our agenda. We had probably an hour-and-a-half meeting, and the top subject, more than 30 minutes, was on adoption issues. What we're hearing from the government, and we continue to hear from the government, is soon they're going to make a decision. Soon, it has not come soon enough for the families.
Sure.
And,
What are the reasons? And I know some of the kids have actually passed away from illnesses that could have been mitigated and probably eliminated had they gotten healthy.
Part of the reason, again, and I don't want to speak for the government of DRC, they have argued that some of the adoptions were not done legally, and because of that, they want to investigate and ensure that legal procedures are used in the future. We're good with that, but most of these cases, in fact, probably the majority, if not all of our cases, were done in a legal manner, and we are just asking that the government release these children. They are still approving new cases, which is a real problem for us, because then it's causing more families to go through the anguish that they're going through. And many of those families are living in DRC with their children, taking care of their children so that they can ensure their health and
But the
well-being.
ongoing approvals would suggest that it's a delay, not a stoppage.
That is my hope and prayer, but it's still taking way too long.
Let me just ask you with regards to Burundi. On July 2nd, obviously, the administration, State Department announced the suspension of several security assistance programs. What conditions must be met by the Burundian government in order for the U.S. government to resume the security aid? And are there other sanctions potentially being contemplated now?
Well, right now, what we are pushing the government to do is start a dialogue, an inclusive dialogue led by the Ugandan government through the EAC. That would be the first step, but I think we have to wait and see what the results of that dialogue is before we could get into any discussions with the government on next steps of resuming a normal relationship with this government. I know, Tom, you might want to follow up.
Sure. So a number of different programs have been suspended for a number of different reasons, including security conditions on the ground. Some of the multilateral lending institutions in the EU and others also have suspended based on everything from failure to meet the most basic transparency, corruption standards, as well as obviously human rights and other concerns. The government, I think, would be mistaken to believe that they are within a step or two of such programs resuming. But the biggest step that could be taken, as Assistant Secretary mentioned, would be the resumption of the dialogue and moving towards, again, stability, as well as meeting that range of standards. And we are continuing to look at the full range of options that are available in terms of programs that are ongoing, as well as looking at the leadership that the African Union and the European Union have taken in holding people accountable, not just on the government side, but anyone also who is resorting to force or violence on the opposition side.
Let me just ask you finally, when Rwanda Major Robert Higero testified, we had vetted him very, very carefully, and I know we asked that the State Department review his evidence, which seemed very compelling. And my understanding is, very clearly, you found it to be credible. And could you how has that affected our relationship with Rwanda. Have we raised it? What has the response been to these extrajudicial killings or the allegations of such? How do they respond to this?
This is an ongoing subject with the Rwandan government at every level. When we've had congressional teams go out, Senator Coons was out there a few weeks ago. In all of our engagements with the Rwandan government, with the president, we have raised our concerns about human rights violations, about reports and allegations of extrajudicial killings, about disappearances. And they have denied their involvement in all of these cases, but we've been clear in our messaging that this will have real deep impact on our future engagement with the Rwandans. They are doing some wonderful things on the economic and social front. They're making progress on the MDGs like no other country. That is an amazing legacy that will be destroyed if on the political and human rights side they don't.
Well, I would suggest that legacy, and I know Rick Warren has been very clear about this, that it is only because, I mean, there is government commitment, no doubt, but it is the faith-based organizations that have made all the difference in the world. And I know, Tom, you might want to speak to that as well, that it has a multiplier effect. I mean, Rick Warren recently brought a map and said, here's where, you know, some of the government potential, stations are for health and the like. And here's a map with stars or flags of where there are faith-based communities that can take these challenges on and truly get it to the people. So, I would encourage you to continue utilizing the faith-based community to the nth degree, because I think that the multiplier effect has no equal. Maybe Special
Sure,
Envoy
just to
will take
echo
that.
what the Assistant Secretary said, not just in Rwanda, but throughout the region, we've emphasized several points, one of which is that fair elections don't just happen on Election Day. It's about the environment that's created in the months and the year ahead of an election. Is there open political space where dissent is welcomed, where assembly and press is welcomed? And we've seen in Rwanda, in DRC, in Burundi, obviously past a breaking point, that political space is closing. We have seen faith-based organizations play a tremendously positive role on all three of those countries, including in Rwanda, and that there's been an effort by leaders in multiple countries to say anyone critical of a government is immediately an opposition party member, in this distinction between civil society organizations who are independent of political parties but raising concerns about human rights, press freedoms, and other issues, as well in the Burundi case of seeing anyone critical as being a putschist or a coup plotter. This is not what happens in stable democratic societies. All of us have faced more than a little dissent and criticism from political opponents, and we have to understand that that's part of a healthy democracy. So we continue to raise that, not just with the government in Rwanda, but governments throughout the region.
I would say I'm not sure we all welcome the opposition, but we certainly know that it is part of a system and it is an important part of it. Mr. Sweet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Each of the countries that are the subject of this hearing face critical moments in terms of political transition. And I just wonder if you might share with the committee what you think we might be able to do to encourage this kind of democratic transition that seems to sort of be up for consideration in each of these three countries, and how we might use whatever tools are available to us to really encourage and persuade the leadership in these countries about the impact that that kind of peaceful transition has on the long-term security and prosperity of their country.
I think the most important thing that we can do is to be consistent in our messaging. It has to come from every source within the U.S. government. If we, from the State Department, are going out to meet with these governments, if members of other agencies are going out to meet with these governments, members of Congress are going out, they have to hear the same message from all of us, that we support democracy, we support stability, and we support countries honoring their constitutions and not changing their constitutions to benefit the incumbent who is in power. And these countries are hearing these messages. I'd like to refer to the fact that we've actually had some success. The one success we've had is that all of these countries have bought into the legitimacy of elections. because in the past, they didn't have elections. They would just declare themselves president for life, and people would have to live with it. So it's a small glimmer there, but the fact that elections provide legitimacy is an important thing. And now we have to work to improve those elections, improve the ability of people in these countries to participate in elections, improve the ability of civil society to have a voice. And then we will end up with examples like Nigeria, and I know we're not here to discuss Nigeria, where civil society was a key player in that election, where capacity building was a key element in having a successful democratic election that led to a peaceful transition.
Let me just offer a few things. One, I think to something Congressman Meadows said at the beginning, one of our biggest enemies here is apathy. And I think as we raise awareness, whether that's from the perch you have here or visiting the region, this is not something that has got the world spotlight. There's so many crises around the world. And the people of the region have struggled for a long time and forged a path forward, and I think they deserve the world's attention. So I think that's one positive thing. Second is, while it is important for all of us, as has been pointed out, to call out backsliding in the region or closing of political space, there's also a lot positive to be said here. Everybody knows that this is a region with unbelievable potential, not just because of its mineral wealth, but because it does have strong leadership in civil society. It's really developed some of the institutions. Some are nascent of strong democracies. And there are heroes who are risking their lives every day to defend basic freedoms. And so I think we have a positive story to tell. Third is continuing to be strong partners to the African Union as well as the European Union in these efforts. The African Union took quite bold leadership last weekend in its communique about Burundi, and I think where they're willing to show leadership in the region across the continent, it's important for us to be there. And the last thing I just want to say is a shout out to supporting our embassies there, and particularly in Burundi, that's been under difficult circumstances with security risks and drawdowns, a lot of long hours. When I go out and visit, they always welcome me, even though I know it's exhausting for them to have visitors. And so continuing to be supportive of our folks that are out there under difficult circumstances.
Thank you. And this spring, MONUSCO helped facilitate the release of 431 child soldiers from rebel groups in eastern Congo. And the UN is currently working to help reintegrate these children back into society. Can you speak a little bit to how the United States is supporting efforts to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate former combatants in the Congo, particularly as it pertains to children?
That's one of our highest priorities in terms of working with governments on disarmament and demobilization. And USAID has a very robust program in DRC working in this area. I don't have the exact details. Tom, you were just out there. You may have more at hand. But it is something that we work very, very closely with MONUSCO on. UNICEF also is, we're supporting their efforts to help integrate these children back into their communities.
Yeah, I just happened to be out at a project in Bukavu not long ago, just last week. It all bleeds together now. But it was an inspiring project, a local organization that had some support from both USAID and Eastern Congo Initiative that was working with both former child combatants, but also young women who had been in sexual slavery or otherwise put at risk. And it was skills training. It was, and one of the things that people have learned over the years, partly with support from our development organizations, is it's not enough just to give the training. There has to be a demand side at the other end, a organization ready to hire them, or some ability to, allow them to start their own entrepreneurship operation. So this is incredibly important. It was something we certainly saw back when I was living in Sierra Leone as well. Finding economic opportunities, but also community and support networks, psychosocial counseling, et cetera. So the United States, along with many other independent organizations, are doing great work on that. But I think it's also a reminder, as we look at how crucial this democratic transition is, that there continue to be elements that could become very problematic if the country started to backslide. And that's one of the reasons we have to stay so focused on the stability element as well.
And finally, as you know, Uganda's constitutional court overturned their anti-homosexuality law. But of course, that was last year. But of course, we know that that doesn't end the homophobic or anti-LGBT activities. So what is the current status of attempts to legalize homophobia and violence in Uganda? What do you think is the prospect that that issue will be raised again? And is it a sentiment that's being reflected in other parts of the region that we should be aware of?
We were very pleased when the Constitutional Court made the decision to not move forward with this bill. And we have since heard from Ugandan authorities that they have no intention of presenting this bill back to their parliament. That said, it always could happen again. We continue to support the LGBT community in Uganda, to encourage respect for their human rights. Human rights are enshrined in the Ugandan Constitution, and so we constantly remind them that respect of the human rights of all Ugandans, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, is critical to the country's success and moving forward in democracy. And I actually see this as one of, at least up to this point, as a success story. The LGBT community in Uganda have told us that they are seeing more support from the police. They feel much more confidence in the chief of police, and they think his leadership has been part of their ability, building their confidence in the community. So we will continue to work this effort. It's not over. This doesn't change hearts and minds. There's still a huge community of people who will express their views in ways that are unacceptable. And what we want to do is encourage the government to hold them accountable, but also to protect the human rights of all of their citizens.
Back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Beddoes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for your testimony here today. I want to refocus on consistency of message. And by addressing consistency of message, this is not meant to be reflective of either of you, because you have a great resume and great credentials. But throughout administrations, whether it's Democrat or Republican administrations, the consistency of message has not been something that the African communities, whether it's in these 4 countries or others, have been able to count on. And it is very troubling to me as a member of Congress that when you go abroad, specifically to Africa, the continent of Africa, and meet with leaders, the inconsistency of us following through on what we promise is a reoccurring theme. How can we address that to make sure that we're not saying that we're making progress or making promises only to find out that part of our diplomatic and potentially political influence in those regions are affected by our inability to keep our word?
Thank you for that question. I usually have someone walking behind me taking notes on promises that I make. And they usually will nudge me.
We borrow some of those? No.
They'll nudge me not to make promises, because if I make promises, we feel that we're committed to following through on those promises. What you're saying, I hear regularly from African leaders. I hear regularly that we have promised to support them in certain areas, and we have not followed up. On the other side of that coin, I hear from advocacy groups that we make promises to hold people accountable, and we don't always follow through in holding them accountable. And so that's on my shoulders to ensure that on both sides.
So if that's the case, and I think that both of those statements are probably accurate, and there are times when the countries do not do what they say they were going to do. How do we just turn a blind eye to that and assume that we're going to hit a reset button and then it's somehow miraculously going to fix itself without identifying the issue and trying to address it? And specifically, all we can do is control what we do. You have the person that follows you around, but so how do we do that? That we let them know that we mean what we say, that we're going to follow through, whether it's accountability or funding or support in a particular area.
I'm going to be honest and frank. It's hard. And the reason it's hard is because we don't always have control over the resources, and the resources are constantly a moving target. So there's a lot of manipulation of resources so that you can honor a commitment here, which means you might not be fulfilling the commitment here because you've moved resources from here to honor the commitments that you've made on this side of the ledger book. And that's part of not having a full control over the resources and
You
having
mean
all the.
you specifically, because it's a State Department budget.
The State Department specifically, but I would say me more broadly within my own small world, not actually having control over those resources. So I say on a regular basis that my highest priority is democracy and governance, to really support governments building capacity in electoral commissions and the capacity of civil society so that they can work to promote better democracy. But if you look at the pie chart, democracy and governance is the thinnest slice of the pie.
Right.
And so I will make commitments. I have elections all over the continent of Africa, and everybody is asking for, please send us a observation team, send NDI, send IRI out to us, send the Carter Center out to us. And I'm always nodding. I'm going to do my best. And they take that as a commitment. And literally, sometimes it's a matter of moving a commitment from somewhere else that may not be urgent at the moment and moving it over here to the urgent, and then finding a way to deal with this when it becomes urgent.
Well,
So that's part of the problem.
Here's what I would offer, and I'll close with this offer and then one more question. As a member of Congress, where we talk about apathy, it doesn't get me votes to be for foreign aid in Africa, generally in North Carolina. I am willing to invest the political capital. I have invested the political capital. I'm willing to work with the chairman and the ranking member because this is something that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm willing to do that. If it means expanding some of those resources from other areas within the State Department where we can, as you put it, I think, stay focused, I'm willing to do that, but we need to know how we can best do that in a bipartisan manner. I'm willing to ask the tough questions. I know that may come as a surprise, but I'm willing to ask the tough questions to do that. But we have to do a better job of, and again, this is not directed at the two of you, we have to do a better job as a nation of saying what we're willing to do, following through on that so that they know that they can count on the word of the American people. Now, let me digress to one other area that you've already touched on, and that has to do with the adoption of these children. Let me be perfectly clear for anybody that's here that's watching, this needs to go back. Enough is enough. We have to solve this problem. I'm tired of coming to hearing after hearing after hearing and saying that it's a high priority, it's our top priority, we're making progress, where you got parents that don't believe that we're making progress. And that message needs to be taken back. It will have financial ramifications, and I'm willing to stake my reputation on that. So if you will take that message back, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
And I appreciate that message from you. When Tom and I were meeting with the foreign minister, and we started on this subject, and he said, I can't believe you're going to start with this subject. And I said, I'm going to be asked about this by our Congress. And I have to say that I started with this subject and got an answer from you. So your message has been heard.
Well, tell him that we're going to look for answers, not that we're working on it. delay is one of those things that everybody says we're working on it, and the time is now for answers.
Well, Ambassador Perriello, your former colleague Adam Schiff sends his regards and actually is going to call you on that exact subject because he has constituents who have been trying to adopt from the DRC for quite a while. So I told him that I would relay that message to you. Thank you both for coming and your time today. I might ask you a few questions that have already been asked since I came a little late, so forgive me if that's the case. But wanted to first start by talking about Burundi, and I know you gave an update on that, Madam Assistant Secretary, but I was just wondering, what at this point do you think is our leverage in Burundi? And I know that the AU has certainly stepped up, and I also know that we have suspended some assistance to Burundi, but do you think it's having an impact? Can I turn to my colleague? Sure.
Sure.
You gave a better answer than I did.
I will try. Well, first of all, please tell Congressman Schiff that I said hello. And I want you to know that I have a picture of one of the kids on my desk in the
That's
office. And I've met with the families, and one of the first things Linda and I talked about is this is not technically in my docket, but they made clear this is an all-team, all-hands-on-deck effort. So all of us are participating in this. It boggles the mind that we are where we are. And I have communicated to President Kabila directly that this is the number one thing I hear about from my former colleagues, because that happens to be true, as the message from Congressman Schiff indicates. On the leverage with Burundi, I think there are two...
I'm sorry, before you go into that, what do you think is the real holdup?
As Assistant Secretary Thomas Greenfield said earlier,
I'm sorry.
it's really difficult to know. I mean, to the question, it's not. While some people have posited that this is an effort to get a demand on this or that thing, it's certainly never been raised. We have gotten clear indications from people senior in the government that there is no legal barrier to this happening tomorrow, while others have certainly argued to us that there are these barriers. But as far as we can tell, there is nothing but political will that stands between this being, at least some of the kids being released tomorrow. But I do want to let those who live and breathe this issue probably give more technical answers on it. But I can tell you that it boggles my mind.
You know, I went to one country, I won't mention the name of the country, not in Africa. And this issue was the same. And one of the things that was happening there was financial. Because a lot of the parents here are, parents, people in waiting to adopt the children, were sending large sums of money to the country to maintain the children in orphanages. And it seemed as though there was a financial incentive from the people who ran the orphanages. I don't know enough about the situation in DRC to know if it's a similar thing, that there's orphanages that people are running and U.S. citizens are supporting.
There have been some allegations in that area, and the fact that new adoptions are still continuing to be approved would suggest to us that that could be part of the problem, because it's a business, and there are people who are benefiting financially from this, and the more children they have in waiting, the more money they're getting. So I do see that as a real issue.
And the other side of it, too, is on our side, and I'm hoping that we are doing good jobs in screening who from here is adopting, because we do have a problem on the other end, too, with some of the families here, then getting into trouble over them. I wanted to, you were going to finish?
I was going to talk about the leverage issue with Burundi. I think there are a couple of categories that we can think about. One is the various stakeholders in Burundi itself, and the second is leverage we have with others who can be playing a positive or potentially negative role. And we talked earlier about how some of the actors in the region, that it's important to make sure that all the neighbors, whether that's Rwanda, Tanzania, Angola, DRC, are all being a force driving the stakeholders to a peace table. We believe that's best done in Kampala, though we would also support the African Union's call, whether that's in Kampala or in Addis. Within Burundi right now, there are a number of drivers, one of which is economic collapse. And while our direct aid has been suspended and the EU is going through its Article 96 procedure, and obviously we try to coordinate and work with not just the AU but donor countries, this is a government that is facing some real threats and challenges, not just physical security threats, but economic crisis. We obviously continue to support the UNHCR efforts. I visited refugee camps in both Tanzania and Rwanda, camps with very tough conditions right now, not because the host governments aren't being generous, but because demands on UNHCR right now, obviously with the Syria refugee crisis and other things, are so high. And so I think there is leverage that we have with various actors, and one of the things we're trying to do is obviously maintain lines of communication and always provide a healthy outlet to a peaceful solution, while making clear that there will be consequences for people both on the government and opposition side who try to escalate, and we believe that some of those can be significant, as well as support for other positive actors in the EAC and the African Union.
If I can just add, I think the other leverage is to really put pressure on the region, on the EAC, on the AU that has been, I think, moving in a great direction, on the UN as well, to make sure that all of the players are actively involved in trying to find a solution and putting pressure on this government. They are feeling the economic pressure, as Tom said. They're feeling the economic pressure from the EU. They're feeling the economic pressure from the IFEs, who have all pulled out their funding, and they're feeling the economic pressure from the private sector. So this is tremendous pressure, but it also shows the extent to which the president is willing to let the country collapse.
Wow. So, and in terms of what our direction is now, since they already had the election, the pressure and all and our leverage is about just making it peaceful, in other words, because I realize that some of his opponents have mysteriously died and there have been ongoing attacks. Is that the direction?
The situation in Bujumbura is incredibly serious. In some neighborhoods, we're almost to a position of ungoverned space where there's nightly violence, and it is in both directions. There are people throwing grenades at police officers. Those police officers are going in and, in some cases, murdering entire families. In one case, that was someone with an IOM badge that had been shown to folks, and the need for accountability that has been promised by the government. The African Union put clearly the impetus for this crisis on the decision to go forward with what they called non-consensual, non-inclusive elections. We have reports from experts and as well as those looking at refugee flows showing that the flow would probably be even higher if not for youth militias in the border areas trying to prevent people from crossing so that the refugee crisis does not look as bad to the international community. So the situation is extremely serious. And in fact, to one of the things Assistant Secretary Thomas Greenfield noted in terms of impact on the region, if I can be blunt, up until recently, there was a little bit of gamesmanship. It felt that people wanted to make this almost a proxy between scoring points with some of the neighbors. And the closer this has gotten to widespread violence, some of those countries, I think, are switching to saying, hey, let's not make this about each other. Let's see this as a genuine crisis in Burundi that we cannot afford to see turn into, take on an ethnic or regional component. And so in that regard, you are seeing very serious issues. However, we are not yet crossed a point of no return. And we believe, along with the African Union and others, that the only thing that can prevent this from having an even more violent end is this inclusive, immediate, internationally mediated dialogue that the AU communique called for.
Well, do you think that would, the goal of that would be new elections, or the goal of that would be what?
So one of the things that we've emphasized to President Museveni and others is that we don't need to solve those questions before the talks start, in part because getting people to the table is the release valve to prevent folks from feeling force is the right way to solve this. However, we would be the first to admit those are going to be thorny and complicated questions. The opposition, at least through the Senard coalition, there are complications of who should represent the opposition, initially said we want to guarantee that President Nkurunziza essentially immediately steps down and there's a transitional government. They've now said they would attend talks immediately without preconditions, but no doubt their position will involve some element of that. The government position will be quite different. But the important thing is to get people at the table and see whether there is a path forward that gets Burundi back on a path that we have to remember for all the very scary situation we're in. 15 years of progress. 15 years of progress across ethnic divisions, a strong neutral military that's held together, some economic progress. Just a year ago, this is not the story we were telling about Burundi. And so that's what we hope, is we can find that table that brings people back to that place.
And can you give an update on the situation in the DRC and Kabila?
So the situation in the DRC...
With regard to elections.
Right. Well, as I said, if the government of Burundi already chose to go down what we think was a very costly path, the DRC is still at that crossroads.
Right.
And it seems that there are some decisions to be made, and certainly there are various moves that have been made by the government that would suggest heading in a direction of what's called glissement or slippage. But the reality is President Kabila has said over and over again, I've never publicly said that I'm going to break the Constitution. I've never publicly said I'm going to run for a third term. We've seen most efforts at getting off a constitutional path have been successfully resisted by civil society and the opposition. It's a dynamic moment, and I would say the next few months are going to be crucial. One of the mantras we've had is, we need to think about DRC as a 2015 issue, not a 2016 issue. The decisions, the hope of being able to see this historic democratic transition at the end of next year has got to be something that's in the next 2 or 3 months, getting this agreement from the Electoral Commission on the calendar, bringing people together, et cetera. So the situation, the stakes are quite high. They're far higher, obviously, just by human count than in any other country in the region. But the good news is we are still in a place where a peaceful democratic transition could happen. And I'll just say, President Kabila, I think, deserves a lot of credit. Here's someone who, as a very young head of his faction, pushed for peace, got elected twice, has developed Kinshasa into a modern, very developed city. There's a lot to be said, of building nascent democratic institutions, of going after at least some of the armed groups. And our hope is that, part of that final legacy will be also to be the first to peacefully transfer power in DRC.
And what's your assessment of the opponents? Is there organized, stable?
Well, so a few things. One, I think one of the things that's very hopeful about DRC is that you see some of the core pillars of a strong democracy. You see a relatively free press. You see a civil society that's independent of all political parties. You see genuine opposition parties. You see a ruling coalition that is like a lot of unruly coalitions where even many of the key leaders in that party have broken from the president on some key votes. So when we think about it, it's not our job to figure out who the right candidate is. It's to let Congolese voices be heard. What's concerning to us, and we spoke about earlier, is this issue about closing political space. There has been some dramatic steps taken towards whether it's use of violence against protesters or surveilling and trumping up charges against civil society opponents. These are foundations of whether or not you'll have a strong democracy. President Kabila told me directly he understands that fair elections are about the space created in the year before an election and not just on election day, and we certainly will continue to work with the government on some of those factors.
And I would just add that I'm still hopeful about DRC. We do have a window of opportunity, and we have to continue to engage with President Kabila and the people around him to get them to do the right thing. They're at a fork in the road, and they could take the right road or they can take the wrong road. But they still have a chance to take the right road, and we have to keep pushing them in that direction.
Good. Well, finally, I just wanted to mention that, and want to thank you, especially Assistant Secretary, for allowing Ann Richard to come and to speak next week when we do one of our policy breakfasts, because I'm real concerned about the refugees. I mean, there's an awful lot of attention on the Syrian refugees, very appropriately. But, before there was the mass exodus from Syria, there was also a tremendous number of African refugees, and I'm just concerned that we might have lost sight of them in two ways. One, I don't know what is happening to them in Europe, But two, when we make commitments to increase the number of Syrian refugees, I think we also need to increase the number of refugees from the continent, especially those that are coming through Libya, but in general. So we sent a number of members signed a letter to Secretary Kerry asking for the numbers to be increased, and I don't know if there's any update on that in that regard, if you wanted to comment.
I'll let Ann, who's going to come up and talk to you, give you the details. But I do know that the African numbers were increased in the coming year. I don't know the exact where they're coming from, but they've increased them to 25,000. And I did carry a message from you from our earlier discussion back to PRM, so they are aware that you are interested in this subject, and they're in a better position to discuss it with you. But I do think they heard your message.
Good. She'll give us the latest update next Thursday. Thank you.
And I'll pass that back to her as well.
Okay.
Let me just add one thing onto that, because when I was in the camps in Tanzania, they were some of the toughest conditions I've seen in an official UNHCR camp in a long time. And I think PRM and state deserve credit for pushing hard, because all the attention had been on the situation in Europe. This was a question of trying to get an additional camp opened, because I think there were 140,000 people in a camp that holds 30,000 at the time. And it was a matter of racing to get that open before the rainy season. And actually, in this case, the Tanzanian government, particularly President Kikwete, deserves a lot of credit for pushing. There was a lot of regional resistance out in the West. So not just in the dollar figure numbers, but really trying to make sure there's attention in these spaces, because the conditions are quite rough. And the people coming over from Burundi now are coming over increasingly malnourished. Anecdotally, we're hearing increased incidents of gender-based violence as people are exiting, because people are waiting to leave because of the fear of violence at the border, and therefore leaving sometimes in more vulnerable conditions.
Well, I appreciate that. I do just want to be clear that I was making reference to the ones crossing the ocean coming into Europe. And I do think that many countries in Africa need to be acknowledged for the fact that they have been absorbing tens of thousands of refugees. But, I mean, I remember a few months ago when 800 died crossing the Mediterranean.
Thank you. Just a few final questions, and of course, if my colleagues have any additional questions, I thank you for your generosity of staying so long. Let me just first of all, we did have Ann Richard testify. I chair the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and we had her testify on Tuesday on Syrian refugees. And one of the biggest takeaways came from the UNHCR representative Pitterman, who said that the proximate cause for the mass exodus that has occurred is the 30% cut in the World Food Program, and that people are now to the point where they don't have food, they're leaving. They just don't have food. Other necessities are scarce as well. And I'm wondering what that cut has done to the 4 countries in the Great Lake regions, if you might want to speak to that, because it seems to be catastrophic. And they're doing it, obviously, the World Food Program is trying to do a triage and figure out where do they put a dwindling number of monies. And what also came across, and this was again from the UNHCR representative, is that they've only gotten 42% of their appeal for the Syrian refugees and the crisis in general, UN, and that they are notoriously low on all their appeals. And there's a lot of laggards who promise and never come through. And but again, how does that affect the refugee situation and people who are at risk? Let me also ask you with regards to the Scaling Up Nutrition Program, which we've had hearings on it. We've had several hearings on it, as a matter of fact. I've introduced a bill called the Global Food Security Act, which puts a heavy emphasis on the first 1,000 days of life, from conception to the second birthday, as being the all-important time to get it right for that child. Of course, you want to see nutrition and good supplementation for a lifetime, but that's where cognitive capabilities are either won or lost. That's where immune systems are built or not built, and it mitigates, if not ends, stunting. And all 4 of the countries, Burundi in 2013, DRC in 2013, Rwanda in 2011, Uganda in 2011, all signed up for the Scaling Up Nutrition. And I'm wondering if you have any sense, does that come up in your meetings? Do we push it as a way? Because it not only makes sure that unborn child and newborn child and that child, as he or she matriculates into adulthood, are healthier, but it has an unbelievably positive impact on maternal health, and the woman and child or children, if it's twins, are that much healthier. Your sense on how that's going, and particularly in war-ravaged Burundi, where obviously these programs sometimes are short-circuited. And finally, on the issue of trafficking, I'm chairing a hearing on November 4th on trafficking, the TIP report. I am the prime sponsor of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and frankly found some flaws in this year's report, which are not reflected in the narrative, but are reflected in the designations. I don't think any of the 4 countries, that we're considering today, were wrongly designated. Burundi is Tier 3, DRC watch list, Rwanda and Uganda are Tier 2. But the Tier 3, I'm wondering, especially Mr. Perriello, how often does that issue come up? Do you get support not only from the embassy and the designated people at our embassies that deal with TIP issues, but does the TIP office itself provide you with updates and guidance? And what has been the response from the governments in question? Because it seems to me when sex and labor trafficking are among the most horrific human rights abuses on the face of the earth. Burundi is Tier 3 for both sex and labor designations, and I just wonder if you might want to elaborate on how that plays into your efforts, both of your efforts, in these countries.
Well, let me start with the questions related to refugees and the impact of WFP's decrease. This is not in my portfolio, but it affects my portfolio. It affects the people of Africa, and it's across the board. It's not just in the 4 countries in the Great Lakes. We're seeing the impact in the refugee camps in Kenya. We're seeing the impacts in the refugee camps in Ethiopia. And then worse, we're seeing a huge impact in Ethiopia among the Ethiopian population in terms of the possibility of a famine. So this is a very, very serious issue for us. It has a little bit to do with climate change, but it also has a lot to do with politics. It has a lot to do with political stability. It has a lot to do with government policies. And this is where I think we can make a difference in terms of getting governments to develop policies that target their communities. It targets agriculture. It puts agriculture on the top of their agenda in terms of building the capacity of people to produce their own food so that they're not dependent upon food aid. I don't have anything on the malnutrition issue that you raised. If you don't mind, I'd love to get back to you on that. That has not come up in any of my meetings with any of the governments, but I'm sure my AID colleagues hear it regularly.
But again, if you could make it part of that, it seems to me that people sign up robustly with all kinds of good intentions, which for whatever reason, different priorities, maybe apathy, and this program gets put on a shelf, at least partially. And again, I don't know of a single program that I have ever seen that has done more and can do more to enhance the life, the well-being, and the mortality, the actual survival of individuals, children, babies, unborn babies, and then their mothers than this one.
Good. And I see this in terms of a political issue as well. And then on TIP, I don't think I have a meeting with any government. I did 50 meetings in New York during the speed dating exercise that we went through, and every single country that was downgraded or not upgraded on TIP raised this as an issue. I will use the example of Comoros, where there was an issue, and they wanted to talk about how to address it and what they needed to do to address it so that they don't get downgraded even further. So I have found among African governments, while they push back, they also take it very, very seriously because they know that we take it seriously. So again, it's not always the best of situations, but I think governments are more and more taking it seriously. We hear a lot of arguments that this is our culture, you don't understand. It's not that we're taking children into trafficking in children. We're taking children from the village so that we can educate them, but you see no signs of the education. So we do have this discussion on a regular basis with governments, and we work very closely with the TIP office to look at how we can help governments address this, because our ultimate goal is to stop trafficking and to help governments address the issue and hold people accountable.
I would echo everything she said on TIP. I can't really be objective about it since I've been a big supporter of the program when I was on your side of things, but it certainly comes up with great frequency. On your point about UNHCR and the 42% pledge, I'll just note that at the time that I was in the camps in Tanzania, they'd only gotten 17% of their pledge for Burundian refugees. That has gone up a little bit with some help from the United States. One thing I'll just say in general with a number of things you're saying, and this takes me back a little bit to my previous job running the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, is the attempt to use metrics in all of these situations. So whether it's WFP cuts or other things, I think we're trying to get better at some predictive analysis of being able to see when there's a drought in country X, how that's going to be affecting things 6 months, 12 months, 18 months out. And I think there's a lot that's useful in coming together. One of the reasons we're still where we are in Burundi, I believe, is not just 15 years of investment on post-conflict transition, on reconciliation, on other things, but the Atrocity Prevention Board and other efforts flagged this a year and a half out as meeting a bunch of indicators. It's where we are with DRC now. So I think all of this is part of that move. And then last of all, I think to the point of some of the programs you're talking about, it might just be a moment to say, we've spent 20 years as a country greatly invested in this region in terms of humanitarian support, as well as development, as well as security support. And as Linda mentioned earlier, underneath a lot of this is good governance. And we've done so much to get up to this point where there's a chance to turn the page where the dynamics are primarily determined by the region's future and not its past. And some of that is the personalities involved and the dynamics. But underneath so many of these programs is a question of good governance. We cannot be, even with people who are desperately poor in Burundi, we cannot send that money through a government that is funneling it in a different direction, or not using it well, or not being transparent. So that's why I think we come back to this idea that I think President Obama, with support from the Hill, has had a really good policy in focusing on constitutions mattering, rule of law mattering, term limits mattering. We're offering our best advice to our countries in the region, and we believe that this is an opportunity to make a real difference in those areas.
One last thought before you leave, Ms. Bass. Are you done? CRS's Callahan testified on Tuesday and made a very important point that I've heard many times. I'm sure I've heard it many times before too, and that is that the ability of faith-based groups not only to be extraordinarily flexible and to get more push and more outcome for the buck, but also the entree, the accessibility, the ability to do something in regions or places of conflict that perhaps other people wouldn't be able to do it because it happens to be a priest or a pastor of some kind, or a bishop. And I'm wondering if you're finding in Burundi, for example, or any of these of the 4 countries, if the faith-based groups have played a significant role, and perhaps there's even a reason or cause for an enhanced role to make sure that the food, the medicines, whatever it might be, gets from us and from other donors and the government and UN, UNICEF, whatever it might be, to the intended recipient.
I would say the faith-based NGOs, assistance groups have been extraordinary and very, very supportive across the board in Africa. In the case of Burundi, you have a president who claims to be a believer. He preaches his beliefs, and we need more voices in the faith-based community here in the United States to talk to him, to let him know that some of the things that he is doing are not acceptable, and that it causes us to doubt his faith. People are dying, people are being killed, and it's happening on his watch. And he has a lot of friends here who are supportive of him, and we would encourage that he gets some messages from that community to do the right thing for the people of Burundi.
Mr. Clark.
say, no one likes that man or woman that comes in late and then talks a whole lot, right? Not great. Not great behavior. I want to, you know, we always get multi-scheduled around here. Y'all know that already, right? So the fact that we come late, or some folks, I don't know if Mark was here or not, that please don't take that as personal reflection.
As a former member, I'm sure Tom understands that
Yeah,
completely.
you know the deal, right? You know? And, you know, y'all are competing with Secretary Clinton, too. So, you know, you got a tough competition today.
We were sure all those cameras were for this hearing.
You're a smart guy. I wanted to make sure that I showed up for 3 reasons. Number one, I have a lot of respect for the chairman and the ranking member. And, you know, you learn that this is a gotcha environment. You know, you ever say anything wrong, they got you, right? And I think this committee has been one place where there's a little less of that. And they're trying to pay attention to an area of the world where, in my view, clearly we have not historically paid enough attention. So the first thing is to show respect there. Secondly, appreciation for what you all do to toil and, you know, in an area or dedicated to an area that's not glamorous, but sure needs, you know, our attention as well. And to the extent that we can, resources, which leads me to the third point, and that is anything that I can do. You know, this region of the world, you know, you're at the intersection of lots of humanitarian problems, ecological problems, and a big watershed all at the same place, right? And so we can't forget about it. And if I say take too much more time after not being here for almost an hour and a half, I think it would be a little bit impolite. So with that, I express my appreciation to what y'all are doing, and I say to the chair, anything that I can do in this effort, of course, we stand ready and yield back.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Clausen. Anything else? I want to thank, anything else you'd like to say before we close?
I just want to add one quick note, which was to your point about faith-based groups. I obviously agree, but the other group that I think can play a very constructive role in the region is the private sector. And in addition to looking at these these democratic transitions, there is a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial activity for the small agricultural entrepreneur as well as for very large corporations. And one of the things we've heard a lot from the private sector is we need to get through these democratic transitions, get through that stability threshold to be able to really see the economic opportunity for folks. So that's another sector we're just engaging. I want to make.
Can I jump in real quick? Spending basically my whole adult life in the private sector, in the multinational environment. We did business in South Africa, but nowhere else, because we were worried about private property rights. And private business can always help in underdeveloped area, because particularly if they have a little bit enlightenment at the top, so that all stakeholders mean something, including employees, communities, etc. But you can never go to shareholders and say, you may lose everything here because they don't respect in this particular country or region private property rights, right? I know you're with me on this. Anything I can do in that regard, any help, you know, if we can make the case for one of these countries that private property rights are respected, then the idea of exterior investment for the benefit of all stakeholders becomes lots easier to make. For those of you in the audience that are from these countries, it scares private investors, even for an export-based investment. It scares us to look at something like that because we're not sure that our private property rights, meaning our investment, and therefore our shareholders would be protected if we set it up. I think there's plenty of investors that don't mind sharing with all stakeholders, including community and labor, folks that work. But you can't lose your investment. Does that make sense? So anything, we can take this offline, but anytime I can help you all, I'm on Chris's committee here. Anytime I can help in that regard, very, very interested in doing so.
That's a strong message to give anytime you have any contact with African leaders. They all want American investors. I hear it on a regular basis. I participated in a meeting by the International Global Group on Business Leadership in Africa. The Secretary Albright and Colin Powell chaired yesterday, and they wanted that we talked about what would encourage American investors to go into Africa and what discourages them, and that point is the biggest point.
This is the biggest point. And without this, the idea that Africa can self-develop, in my mind, is a long putt, and our intentions can be as wonderful as we want them to be. In our facility in South Africa, the government told us that we didn't have any choice but to sell them a certain percentage of the equity. Now, I can do that as CEO of the company, but imagine if I tell my shareholders I'm going to build a second factory in that country. I'd get laughed out of the boardroom, right? And so, you know, this message, I think you and I are in violent agreement here that we ought to, anytime I can help you make that pitch, because that will attract investment, because there's a lot of good about these areas in terms of investment prospects as well, I think. Thank you.
No, we all know that. Thank you so very much for your testimony, your leadership, and look forward to working with you going forward. Hearing is adjourned.